The Strait of Hormuz ceased to be a commercial route in the early hours of the morning when Abbas Araghchi, Iran's foreign minister, stepped to a podium in Tehran and declared that the United States had launched what he called a reckless adventure with consequences Washington has no capacity to calculate. Less than 6 hours later, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps activated unannounced naval exercises in the narrowest stretch of the Channel, the 26 miles separating Iran from Oman, and oil prices began to climb before the first Iranian patrol vessel appeared in satellite imagery. The number that defines what was at stake in those opening hours is this: approximately 21 million barrels of oil transit the Strait of Hormuz every single day, the equivalent of 21% of all global liquid fuel consumption, or in terms anyone can grasp, enough to fuel every vehicle in Western Europe and Japan combined for 24 hours. Each hour of disruption in that corridor represented an estimated $875 million in the value of cargo in transit, according to calculations from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. This was not a hypothetical crisis. It was a crisis with a clock. And here lay the paradox that planners on both sides had failed to calculate. Iran, by threatening to close the artery through which the bulk of its own oil export revenue flows, was pointing a weapon that, if fired, would destroy the finger pulling the trigger first. Tehran exports between 1,200,000 and 1,500,000 barrels per day, the overwhelming majority through the very strait it was now threatening to blockade. The greatest paradox of the entire crisis resided precisely here. The weapon the regime had deployed to wound its enemy was at that very moment dismantling its own source of income. The equation had changed. Step back for a moment and take in the full picture. The escalation did not emerge from a vacuum. In the weeks prior, Washington had intensified what the Pentagon was describing as forward presence operations in the Persian Gulf, with the USS Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group repositioned at the eastern entrance of the strait, accompanied by at least 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers equipped with the Aegis ballistic missile defense system, a shield capable of simultaneously tracking and intercepting more than 100 airborne targets, the electronic equivalent of watching every bird in a storm-darkened sky. The official pretext was the protection of commercial shipping. The practical effect was a naval encirclement less than 100 miles from the Iranian coastline. Araghchi, a career diplomat who had participated in the negotiations for the 2015 nuclear agreement and witnessed its collapse under the Trump administration, chose his words with the precision of someone who understands the weight of every syllable on the diplomatic chessboard. In using the phrase reckless adventure, he was not improvising. He was signaling that Tehran classified the American maneuver not as defensive deterrence, but as active provocation. In Iranian diplomatic language, that distinction is the difference between a formal protest and a justification for military response. This man is not the emotional protagonist of this analysis. He is the diplomatic coordinate of what the regime was prepared to risk. And the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, Iran's parallel military arm that reports directly to the supreme leader, not to the civilian government, responded with a speed that suggested prior planning, not improvised reaction. Boghammer-class fast attack boats, each equipped with short-range anti-ship missiles, were detected in formations that analysts at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London described as consistent with swarm tactics, dozens of small, fast vessels converging on larger targets, a strategy designed to overwhelm the defense systems of conventional warships. The cost of each of those boats does not exceed $500,000. The cost of the American destroyer they threaten exceeds $2 billion. The asymmetry was the strategy itself. The plan had failed, not because the enemy was stronger, but because the enemy had anticipated every move before the first shot was fired. But the true impact of this operation extended far beyond the numbers on the battlefield. In the first 12 hours following Araghchi's declaration, Brent crude jumped $14, a move of nearly 11% in less than a single trading day. The kind of swing that commodity market operators describe as a panic event, not a price adjustment. The maritime insurance risk premium for vessels transiting the strait, the additional fee insurers charge to cover the possibility of attack, seizure, or collateral damage, tripled within hours, rising from 0.3% of cargo value to more than 1%. For a supertanker carrying 2 million barrels valued at $160 million, that meant an additional cost of more than $1 million per crossing. Ship owners began recalculating alternative routes around the Cape of Good Hope. A detour of nearly 4,000 miles and 10 to 14 additional days at sea that on its own would add between $500,000 and $800,000 in fuel costs per voyage. Every additional day was one more day of pressure on the countries most dependent on that resource, and those countries would in turn generate pressure on Washington that the White House, sooner or later, could not afford to ignore. And there was a layer we had not yet touched, and it changes the nature of this analysis entirely. In the shadow of this confrontation between Washington and Tehran, there was an actor watching everything with calculated satisfaction. And here was the player the headlines were not mentioning with the frequency the data demanded: China. Beijing is the single largest buyer of Iranian oil, absorbing between 80 and 90% of Iranian exports at prices discounted up to $15 per barrel below market, an involuntary subsidy that Iran's international isolation converts into a Chinese competitive advantage. Every escalation at Hormuz that drives up the global price of oil without interrupting the direct Iran to China supply chain widens Beijing's energy cost advantage over its industrial competitors in Europe, Japan, and South Korea. In practical terms, the chaos benefited the world's second-largest economy, which did not need to move a single warship to reap the rewards. This is not merely a question of territory on a map. It is a question of who controls the energy arteries of the 21st century. The historical analogy that captures this dynamic with the greatest precision is not the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, though both episodes involve superpowers in direct naval confrontation with the risk of catastrophic escalation. It is the Suez Crisis of 1956, when Nasser's Egypt nationalized the canal and revealed within weeks that control of a narrow maritime corridor could redistribute global power more rapidly than any treaty or alliance. At Suez, Britain and France discovered they could no longer project imperial force without Washington's approval. At Hormuz, 7 decades later, the question was whether Washington could project force without triggering an energy crisis that would corrode its own economic foundation and that of its allies. In both cases, the narrow corridor functioned as a geopolitical amplifier, a point where localized military action produces immediate, disproportionate global economic consequences. And here was what that layer revealed about the deeper dynamics of the crisis. Iran did not need to close Hormuz to win the escalation. It only needed to make the possibility of closure credible for long enough that the economic cost of uncertainty would do the political work its armed forces could not accomplish militarily. Every hour of Iranian naval exercises in the Strait added hundreds of millions of dollars in risk premium to the global energy market. Every satellite image showing IRGC fast boats in swarm formation was in practice an invisible tax on every liter of fuel consumed in Europe and Asia. The weapon was not the anti-ship missile. The weapon was uncertainty. The board had been overturned. And then we arrive at the question no analyst was answering with sufficient clarity. The Iranian regime was operating at that moment under domestic pressure that international headlines consistently underestimated. Official Iranian inflation hovered above 40%. The rial had lost more than 95% of its value against the dollar since 2018, and youth unemployment among Iranians under 30, who represent more than half the population, exceeded 30% according to World Bank estimates. For the clerical establishment in Tehran, the crisis at Hormuz served an internal function every bit as crucial as the external one, demonstrating that the regime still controlled the most powerful lever it possessed, the capacity to threaten global energy supply at a moment when its domestic legitimacy was facing accelerating erosion. The era of cheap and feared offensive action had been closed forever. The era of cheap, intelligent, and lethal defense had officially begun. Pull the camera back, and what emerges is an image different from the one the headlines were projecting. The confrontation at Hormuz was not simply a bilateral crisis between Iran and the United States. It was the first real test of who controls the energy arteries of the 21st century. And the outcome of that test will redraw the map of global power for decades. Russia, which depends on elevated oil prices to finance its war in Ukraine, was watching the escalation with direct interest. Every dollar added to the barrel by the Iranian crisis represented additional revenue for the Kremlin at a phase when Russia's fiscal deficit, the gap between what the state collects and what it spends to sustain the war, was already consuming more than 6% of GDP. Hormuz and the Donbass were connected by the same invisible pipeline, the price of a barrel. And here was what that detail changed in the complete equation. What Araghchi had set in motion with a declaration of 23 words, a reckless adventure with consequences Washington has no capacity to calculate, was neither conventional diplomacy nor rhetorical bluff. It was the deliberate activation of a mechanism that transforms words into measurable economic cost, uncertainty into a global tax, and a 26-mile strait into the most volatile variable in the world economy. The question that remained open was not whether Iran would close Hormuz. The data suggested that doing so would destroy Tehran before it destroyed Washington. The question was how long the regime could sustain the threat's credibility before internal economic pressure. American military response or Beijing's silent calculation forced a resolution that none of the three actors would control alone. If this analysis has revealed a layer of the conflict you had not yet considered, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next chapter of this crisis will demand context the headlines will not provide. And that chapter was closing in.